Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Hello, I'm Major Chris Parker, and this podcast topic is Army Leadership and Leader Assessments. With me today is Brigadier General Charles Masaracchia, Director of the Mission Command Center of Excellence, Sergeant Major Robert Ferguson, Sergeant Major, Mission Command Center of Excellence, Colonel Sam Saine, Director of the Center for Army Profession and Leadership, or CAPL, Colonel Rich Creed, Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, or CADD, and Colonel Chris Cardoni, Director, Commander Assessment Program. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, good to be here.
So today we're discussing Army leadership and leader assessment from both a doctrine and institution perspective. There have been several updates on both fronts over the past 2 years, and we're going to touch on a few of them today. In April 2019, the Center for Army Profession and Ethic merged with the Center for Army Leadership to form the Center for Army Profession and Leadership, or CAPL. In July of that year, Army Doctrine publication, or ADP 6-22, titled Army Leadership and the Profession, was updated. And later that summer, the Army piloted the first Battalion Commander Assessment Program, or BCAP, which has now been executed twice at Fort Knox. In addition, the Army conducted the first iteration of the Colonel Command Assessment Program, or CCAP, in the fall of 2020. Finally, CAPL spent much of last year refining and piloting Project Athena, a career-long leader assessment and self-development tool that is now being conducted across all the basic officer leader courses, or BOLICs. But with leadership as the unifying thread tying all of these initiatives together, I think it's best to start there. So, Colonel Creed, if you could kick us off with kind of an Army definition and description of leadership and how we frame it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, ADP 622, leadership, Army leadership in the profession, defines leadership as the activity of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. But it kind of goes a little bit further than that. It talks about what an Army leader is. So leaders provide leadership, right? So we had to talk about what a leader is. So the Army says an Army leader is anyone who, by virtue of assumed role or assigned responsibility, inspires and influences people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. So in a practical sense, it kind of reflects, those definitions reflect the Army's attitude that if more than one soldier is in a place, one of them's in charge. And the expectation culturally within the Army is that it's not necessarily rank-based. It could be situationally contextual, but somebody is always in charge, which means it's vitally important that people understand what being a leader is. So we have this Army leadership requirements model, and I think we'll probably get into some of that a little bit later this morning, but it kind of frames leadership in two things. What you should be and what you should do. So the attributes get to what you should be. They talk about character, the Army values, empathy, discipline, humility, your presence, your military and professional bearing, your physical fitness, confidence, all those kinds of things. But the things that you do, the competencies, we talk about leading others, building trust, extending influence, leading by example, setting the example, your ability to communicate. Other competencies are about developing. Develop yourself, you develop others, you create a positive environment for the development of others. And this idea of stewardship of the profession, right? We're here to protect the profession. And then we achieve. So we want to get results, because ultimately that's what military organizations are designed to do. So you have to anticipate, you have to integrate tasks, understand roles, assign roles, provide resources, and set priorities. So there's a distinction between the attributes and competencies, in that competencies are something that the Army expects us all to develop, and because they can be developed, whereas the attributes tend to encompass enduring personal characteristics. It doesn't mean that they can't be shaped over time, particularly if you come into the Army when you're very young. But it takes a lot of time to mold those, whereas the competencies we expect people to develop constantly.
I've got a question.
Rich,
General Masaracchia, does doctrine delineate anywhere the attributes and competencies by rank, position, or branch?
We talk about levels of leadership, sir. So the short answer is yes. and we do it in lots of different places. So in terms of competencies especially, each of the branches has a series of competencies that they expect a lieutenant, a captain, a major, throughout their career to be able to display those types of competencies. When in 622, we talk about levels of leadership too. So I'm a direct leader, I'm an organizational leader, and that corresponds with rank and then your responsibilities over time. So as you become more senior, you become less of a direct leader. I mean, we always are direct leaders. There's always a direct subordinate. But when you have that organizational piece, the Army addresses that doctrinally as well.
Thank
Yes, sir.
Now, the Keystone Leadership Doctrine, ADP 6-22, was just updated in July of 2019. Colonel Saine, can you give us some background onto what was revised and updated in 622?
Sure, Chris, and thanks for the question. I think Colonel Creed did a great job of laying out some of the elements of ADP 622 that are foundational to who we are as an Army and how we see leadership and leader development. And that starts with the Army Leadership Requirements Model and the Be No Do pieces that he talked about. But much of the content in the new ADP 622 endures. It provides really a common framework and language and expectations. It sets the foundation for those attributes and competencies that Colonel Creed talked about. The roles and levels of leadership that he referenced. But there's really kind of four areas that I can talk about that your listeners might be interested in. And that's really one that Colonel Creed talked about, and I'll expand a little bit more. That's the revisions to the leadership definition. Some additions, an addition of the dynamics of leadership and the role of followers, or what is termed as followership. The introduction of a term called counterproductive leadership. And really the addition of ADRP1. So ADRP1 was incorporated. So it is the Army profession and Army ethic. That's the foundation of the Army profession exists within the leadership requirements models, attributes and competencies, things like trust, honorable service, military expertise, stewardship. And then the historical Army ethic, things like loyalty, integrity, duty, selfless service. That's contained in the Army values, and Colonel Creed kind of talked about that a moment ago. The second thing is really the change to the definition, and Colonel Creed touched on this, but I just wanted to expand a little bit. So really, as he talked about, it was really the change in the use of an action versus a process in leadership. So what the team wanted to convey was that leadership is a discretionary activity that a leader chooses to do in a specific situation. There's not a sequence or some recipe for success that will always work. Leaders have to be smart about how they lead across the competencies. It takes the leader's mindful attention, at least until good leadership actions become natural and second nature to that leader at whatever level they're at. What works for one leader with one set of followers in one situation may not work in another combination. So one leader may need to use more compliance-based influence techniques with untrained soldiers, or maybe a civilian workforce. But once those soldiers or those civilians are trained, the leader should use more commitment-based influence techniques, and that's covered in the ADP. This is especially true if the rapport has been established and the followers respond well to a commitment-type influence. The next thing really I talked about at the beginning was the emphasis or discussion on followership. So while the role of followers has been expanded upon in the ADP, there really isn't an additional emphasis placed on it in the 2019 version. The ADP 622 acknowledges that leadership is more than about a designated positional leader. Leadership is the energy created by the leader and that energizes his or her followers to accomplish the mission they've been given according to the guidance that leader has provided. Leadership is really about the space between that leader and their followers and what ensues from that intersection. Followership is not really a thing separate and distinct from leadership. Following is what naturally comes from leading. Our oaths of office we take as military leaders or civilians requires us to support and defend the Constitution, and among other things like allegiance and obligation to faithfully discharge the duties assigned to us. The fourth and last thing I touched on is a term that was new in ADP 622, which was counterproductive leadership. It's not necessarily a new concept. Some of your listeners may have previously heard that the term toxic leadership. Toxic leadership was introduced in the previous ADP 622 in 2012, after there was a growing number of incidents of largely Army commanders and other leaders relieved for conduct unbecoming an officer or, in some cases, a negative command climate. The concept was referred to in that version as negative leadership. Those cases were substantiated by a series of findings and surveys from the field and documented in things like our annual survey of Army leadership. Further research and development was conducted in a partnership between CAPL, the Department of the Army IG, JAG, the Army Research Institute, CGSOC, and a series of others. And that led us really to the development and definition of the term counterproductive leadership. Really out of that research, it was felt that the phrase negative leadership was really an oxymoron, that it truly wasn't leadership if it was negative. But the phrase counterproductive leadership, we are describing actions and attitudes that go against the positive, energizing effect that leadership is supposed to have, as Colonel Creed talked about before. But by defining and identifying observable behaviors and their effects on others and organizations, counterproductive leadership moves towards some type of observable behavior, vice, and imprecise labeling of people as toxic. The term toxic obviously carries some baggage, and it's really kind of a buzzword to some people. But again, this expanded leadership also shows leaders what is not acceptable, but in the same vein, it informs followers what they should not tolerate. So again, there's just a couple things to cover as we moved into the 2019 version.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Hey, Chris, let me throw a couple of things out there too, Sam, because there's a tension sometimes, certainly from the doctoral perspective, of putting things in a language that, because doctors are supposed to be able to be read and understood by somebody on a first read with a 12th grade education. And one of the things that we had worked very closely with CAPL with was we really wanted to take a look at the language and put it into a practical sense. So over time, we had informed the Army's leadership doctrine by science and studies and research and all those things, but sometimes the language that we used in our doctoral publications was not easily understood by folks in squads and platoons. All right, it was written at a little bit too much high of a level. We didn't have good examples in there explaining to people, describing the concepts, so we really wanted to get after that. The other thing we wanted to do is we wanted to mirror the fact that the Army combined the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic and the Center for Army Leadership together. And so we thought logically it made a lot of sense to describe the Army profession and define that up front in the book, because that sets the context for why we develop leaders in the first place, right? It's to become members of that profession. And so we wanted to explicitly link those two things instead of having them in two different books.
So, Sergeant Major Ferguson, on that note, can you maybe give us a little bit more insight?
So to add on, for the majority of the leadership population is a lot of the NCO Corps to get after some things. So we even talk about it in the manual of how an NCO's ability is to translate a lot of the mission command down to the action of the organization. So while the senior leader is responsible for what the unit does or fails to do, success demands that all will perform duty with discipline into the standard. And that's where, what Colonel Creed mentioned about, hey, somebody is always in charge. And the adage that NCOs have talked about since, the times down in Valley Forge is, hey, when in charge, take charge. And that's what we need a lot of the organizations to do and a lot of leaders to do. And that's what, we talk about, this is my squad. We need every individual in the organization to realize that this is my responsibility. It's not necessarily my headquarters responsibility or my higher headquarters, or I need Army policy to come into place. Leadership is in action. It is not the inaction. To add on to what Colonel Saine talks about, when in charge, take charge. And that's what we will see out in basic training land, to where there is a private put in charge of a platoon, and they're the platoon guide. And if there's 3 soldiers marching, one of them is calling cadence. And we have to instill those types of things. So it's imperative on the organization to realize that it is everyone's responsibility to be a leader, not necessarily the role or grade, what General Maz was talking about. That's not, we have that in there, but the implied intent is that everyone, owns into it. We cannot move forward, and that's why we have to, proliferate the "this is my squad" mentality to make sure that all soldiers, this is your Army, soldiers. This is not my Army, it's not General Maz's Army. This is your Army, you get to shape it. I need you to take action. With that, we talked about the followership piece there, Colonel Saine. In leaders and followers, it's a simultaneous responsibility. And there's an expression we use a lot in the Army is what interests my boss fascinates me. Well, what we also have to remember at the same time is what interests the soldier fascinates me. And that is you have to be able to balance those in everything we do. Because when we talk about gets results, sometimes that is something that's easily measurable. But it's because, we're accomplishing the mission and all those other things. But, to what interests the soldier fascinates you, you're able to achieve those results much easier. Because I can tell you there's very few times that I'm surprised of what soldiers can do in the Army, but I'm always amazed at how much they can accomplish because you're going to give them that intent. And, that every soldier wants to get up every day and to try to succeed. That's what we want to do. So we just need to be able to harness that. And there's a couple other ways we can do that. When we talk about it, also in ADP, we have formal and informal leaders. So when we talk about the assigned roles and positions and ranks, we also have many informal leaders. And out here, I think we can recognize all the informal leaders we've ever had in our units. Some of those might be, say, our SARC rep, or maybe our boss rep, or maybe just, your motor sergeant who somehow can get everybody to get things done. But that motor sergeant, we'll say is not the green tab leader we have in our organization. But we know that is an infectious individual that's able to get, positive results out of an organization. Well, how do we do that? We used to talk about, hey, you have legitimate power. And that's, something that, by your rank, maybe your drill sergeant campaign hat and the badge where soldiers know automatically that's an authority figure. I'm going to go ahead and follow that individual. And we have things, maybe people will talk about transactional leadership. Say, hey, I'm going to reward great performance, or I'm going to retrain or potentially punish if I'm a commander, poor performance or behavior to get that. But the two things that I think, as we strive for the leader requirements model, character, presence, intellect, leads, develops, achieves, is using the expert and referent power and probably even informational power, such as I will communicate consistently with my soldiers and never leave them informed. Those things of being an expert in warfighting, an expert in your craft, all that stuff, that's what will inspire soldiers to follow you. If you think about, hey, what makes a good leader is, well, who would I follow?
Competence to a certain degree. You need to be competent.
Absolutely, and that's why we, maybe we're talking about competence as an element and a principle of mission command, because, expert power drives leadership. People will follow, a leader. When we say, hey, that's a soldier, that's a soldier, that's who we're going to follow. Absolutely. And then the referent power is, a lot of folks will talk about how, hey, I may not remember, what, this, first sergeant or platoon sergeant, what they did for the organization, but I know how I felt after I had an engagement with them. So when you have that referent power and that positive interaction with people, then of course they'll follow you. And, all that will get past that blind trust that we have in an organization. Just say, hey, yes, we are armed professionals. We all sworn to an oath. That's how you build upon that trust, is by having those types of interactions and ability. So I just wanted to add those things out there for all the NCOs out here to listen today.
Oh, absolutely. No, I appreciate it, Sergeant Major.
I'd like to add one thing about what Colonel Creed said. And I say this to all the listeners. If you haven't read Doctrine lately, because you were jaded early in your career by the complexity of how it was written and your inability to understand it, I recommend you go out there and find one of the new publications that is written, because there's a completely different style now to how they're writing this. This is written at a level that you can understand it, as Colonel Creed said, on the first time, and understand what the point they're trying to get across to you. And I think that's a problem that we probably have right now, is that we've all been jaded early in our careers, so we just couldn't understand the doctrine. And now it is written at a level that every individual from the platoon all the way up is going to get something out of and be able to understand it on that first read.
Yes, sir. And, there's another piece, too, is, the Army exists for a reason, right? It's to fight our nation's wars, in a nutshell. And so we want to make sure that our leadership doctrine is tied into how we want to command and control forces. And so the Army's approach to command and control is what? It's mission command, right? Well, to execute a mission command approach to operations requires that we develop leaders capable of executing that style of command and control, which is fundamentally bound up to leader development. I mean, you can't have the one without the other. And the level of effort and the time-consuming nature of that can be daunting to some people, I think, to say, okay, not only do I have to develop myself, but I have to develop all these subordinates. And it's a continuous thing. It's not a one and done. And so, a lot of the challenges the Army's had in the past, I think, results from people who are much more comfortable just telling people what to do and then holding them to these very exacting standards without ever developing them to the point where they can do that without being micromanaged. I mean, so when we looked at 622, it was tied to 6.0, but it was also tied to the Army's focus on large-scale combat operations, as well as all the other types of operations it conducts.
Yes, sir. So I think we've got some of the doctrine out of the way. I'd like to kind of turn now to Colonel Saine. If you could give us some background on your organization, the Center for Army Profession and Leadership, if you don't mind, and your mission, purpose, what you guys do.
Great. Thanks, Chris. You covered a little bit of it in the introduction. And listen, if a lot of your listeners, probably like myself, I had not heard of CAPL, I'll be honest, before I became its director. I had heard of the Center of Army Leadership, and that's been around for 40 plus years as a part of our Army. The Center of the Army Professional Ethic, which was located at the United States Military Academy West Point, was merged again, like you said before, with CAPL in 2019, and that was really to bring together a lot of the efforts, concepts, and things surrounding leadership and leader development in our Army under one more robust organization. So, in terms of a mission, CAPL, what it does for the Army is it studies, develops products, and provides services really to strengthen the Army profession, improve our leadership, and support leader development for the Army. And that's really in order to achieve a couple overarching things, and that's a positive command climate and mission-ready units. And there's a lot of pieces and parts inside of that. But some of the efforts that are currently on our plate right now, some of your listeners may be familiar with. You referred to probably the two that are we're spending the most time on right now in the introduction, and that is our support to the Command Assessment Program, or BCAP and CCAP, through CAPL and an instrument called the Army Commander's Evaluation Tool, or ACET. We really gather peer and subordinate feedback on an individual or candidate before they enter the BCAP and the CCAP process. And it's really to provide more information to the Army as they go to make some key decisions on our next set of battalion and brigade level commanders. And I think you're going to talk about those programs a little more in a moment. The second one you referred to is Project Athena. So this is really the introduction of career-long assessments into professional military education. I know we're going to talk it a little bit in a moment, but that's really a battery of assessments that were introduced in the officer education system and are going to grow in other parts of our Army to really help an individual become a better, more self-aware leader. Another thing that I think most of your listeners are aware of and we've talked about here is CAPL is the Army's proponent for ADP 622, leadership, FM 622, leader development, and then ATP 622.1, the counseling process. All those are in one way being updated or changed. As Colonel Creed talked about, as we evolve and we move towards an MDO force. A couple other ones just to touch on real quick. I referred to the Army's annual survey on leadership, or the CASL. So some of your listeners may have filled this out for the Army, and this is really to inform our Army senior leaders on trends in our Army on leadership and leader development, as well as a wide range of other things on cohesion, on diversity, inclusion. And this is really a 15-plus year longitudinal study to help the Army make better decisions as we move forward in terms of doctrine, programs, and a series of our processes. And then the last kind of two things is, we support PME and the operational force in terms of really what we refer to as common core training on leadership and leader development. And that's to make sure we're, one, aligned with doctrine, and then we're also leveraging the experiences, lessons learned, and best practices from throughout the force. And then the last one, it's just kind of a shameless plug, but like I said, before I came to become the director of CAPL, I really wasn't aware of the immense amount of work that's been done by a team over a long period of time. And some of that is really is seen in what we call as how-to tools. Those how-to tools are available on the CAPL website, and they are really there to help leaders, followers, teams to become better, whether it's a self thing or whether it's to help the team come together, help a commander or command team translate a command climate survey and apply it appropriately, and then really how to build cohesive teams. Really from even the squad level, or as the Sergeant Major talked about, as this is my squad, all the way up to helping command teams at the battalion and brigade level. So really I appreciate the opportunity, Chris, to expand on that. And we have a couple other things, like the Army Leader Exchange, really a way for folks across the force to share information. There's a lot of different platforms out there in terms of Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but the Army has some great ones that we do partner with some of those too. And it's really an opportunity for all your listeners and folks, whether in or out of uniform, to ask questions and to just share ideas. But again, thanks, Chris.
Yes, sir. Well, one of those subjects that you mentioned, sir, we're going to drill down on, and that's the Battalion Commander Assessment Program, or BCAP. I know that's gotten a lot of buzz over the past year. And so, General Masaracchia, can you explain BCAP, its components, and kind of how the Army is using this new program?
Well, I brought the subject matter expert with me, Colonel Cardoni of CAP, and I think he's the best person to be able to explain the assessment program that goes on up there.
Sounds good, sir.
Thank you, sir. First off, I just want to recognize Army Talent Management Task Force. The Command Assessment Program is one of their multitude of great initiatives they have currently ongoing within the Army, with the director of ATMTF being Major General McGee. So our role here as part of the Command Assessment Program Directorate inside of Mission Command Center of Excellence is really to assist ATMTF in the execution of the Command Assessment Program. It's not meant to replace the CSL process. What the Command Assessment Program does is it complements the traditional CSL process, provides the Army additional relevant information to help folks make the right, better decisions in terms of who's going to be placed in those command positions or those key build positions or any key leadership position for that matter. So again, it's a 4-day process. Really, a candidate is invited. I'll give you an example. For last January, which was the first major command assessment program run by Army Talent Management Task Force, roughly little over 2,000 lieutenant colonels were eligible, and really about 750 were invited. So if you look at that, that's about 35%, 36% or so that are invited to actually go to the command assessment program. It's assumed through the traditional CSL process and being invited to CAP that, a lot of those, the majority of the candidates are already ready for command. But what's going to determine whether you're ready for command or not is really running through a series of assessments over a 4-day period. So those assessments are the Army Command Evaluation Tool. That's really peer and subordinate feedback. Meeting height, weight standards, the leadership reaction exercise. When you hear that, think leadership reaction course, but you're not out there on a range somewhere jumping over a wall. It's really the same composition of folks you're in a team, but the exercises are a little more cognitive in nature. Psychometric assessments, a cognitive, non-cognitive assessment, written communications, the Army Physical Fitness Test, an operational psychologist interview, and then finally, the Army Comprehensive Talent Interview, better known as what we call the panel operation. So all those assessments are broken down into 3 different categories. They could be a screening assessment, a scoring assessment, or an informed assessment. An informed assessment, such as the Army Command Evaluation Tool or the peer subordinate feedback, that's information presented to the panel during the Army Comprehensive Talent Interview. A scoring assessment contributes to a change in the OML or reestablished OML once all the candidates go through the command assessment program. And then finally, the screening assessment is that could find you not ready for command and removed from command consideration for that year. So there are only 3 assessments that are screening that could remove you from consideration for the year. That's failure to meet height, weight standards, failure to meet the standards of the Army Physical Fitness Test, and then finally, the Army Comprehensive Talent Interview. During that process, you're found not ready for command. Again,
What the panel sees is the totality of the assessments that take place over the 4 days. So some of the assessments also may do all three. You know, the Army physical fitness test, that also screens, it provides a score, and it also informs the panel. Some may only do 2 of the 3, such as the cognitive, non-cognitive. That provides a score, but it also informs. So that's, in a nutshell, those are what the assessments over a 4-day period, all the candidates will go through.
Well, thanks, sir. So from how you describe that, sir, it sounds like this is really just a final vetting off of already highly qualified candidates. But General Masaracchia, I'm wondering, what was the Army getting after? Why did they see this final vetting as being necessary?
Well, I think there's a misnomer out there that you have to have a problem to institute change. There was no problem with our legacy CSL process. That process is still there. It still does exactly what it's always done. But I'll paraphrase a quote from the Chief of Staff of the Army. What corporation in America would spend only 2.5 minutes selecting its mid and senior grade leadership within inside of its corporation? And that's exactly what we were doing before. So the legacy CSL program still is executed as it's always been. It still identifies everybody that they feel is ready for command. And then they go through the assessment process to get a more holistic look at them and identify any blind spots or weaknesses that they might have that might make them not ready for command at this point in time.
Okay. And sir, if I could add one thing to that. I mean, go back and look through your OERs and look at the senior rater comments. You could fit more information in one tweet than usually what a board member is seeing during a promotion board or selection board. So, and at the strategic level, I mean, look at our adversaries across the world right now. The technological gap is closing very quickly with some of our adversaries, but the one key component where we have dominance, we want to maintain that dominance, is our personnel and keeping and retaining our talent. So at the strategic level, this program contributes in order to keep and maintain our current talent and attract new talent. And so I think it's an absolutely great program in terms of that piece as well.
Well, there's the other things. I don't know if it's an anecdote, but I've heard at least several of the senior leaders say that we spent more time evaluating people to go into Special Forces or Delta Force or the Ranger Battalion in terms of interviews and so forth than we ever did for people who are going to command 500, 800, even 1,000 people, or at the brigade level, 5,000 or 6,000 people.
And in addition, also, I mean, it contributes to changing the culture of our Army and getting towards the culture of assessment. So, these assessments that take place during CAP, they're not a secret. I mean, they're CAP handbooks that are given to candidates. Folks can do some research and see what they are, but there are things you could do on your own. We're seeing candidates do this before they even get there. Hey, I've identified I have a weakness in my writing skills. I'm going to go out and hire somebody, and candidates have done this, hired somebody to help them with their writing skills, so they're better prepared. And even if they're not yet ready for command, or determined not yet ready for command, they went ahead and they improved themselves in one area where they recognized there was a weakness. Recently, an article was published in Harvard Business Review. It's the November-December 2020 issue. It's called "Reinventing the Leader Selection Process," and it was written by Colonel Everett Spain. It's great article. It really goes into detail of the why and how behind the Army Comprehensive Talent Interview. So I recommend everybody go and read it. It'll go into much more greater detail why certain decisions were made, of how the panel is composed, why it's double blind, those types of things. So I highly recommend you read that. Thank you.
So what we've got is a more comprehensive, assessment is the best way to look at it. But one of the things I'm curious about is the selection board at the end of this. First off, who sits on the board and how do they come to consensus? I'm also curious if there are any former battalion or brigade command sergeant majors on the board. I feel like that could be a vital piece of it.
Chris, that's a great question. So you've got voting members and non-voting members on the board. The voting members is 1 major general, 2 brigadier generals, 2 colonels that are former brigade commanders, and then you have a non-voting member, which is a nominative select CSM. So already been battalion brigade and is at the general officer level. He's a non-voting member. So as you stated, we want his feedback and his assessment because he has worked with leadership at this level before. He is the only person on this board that is afforded the opportunity to speak. So he gives his assessment to the voting members. Then just like the legacy CSO process, the other board members do not communicate. It is based off of their personal perception of how the interviewee did on their answering of the questions that were presented.
Interesting. Now, kind of on the same vein, and we touched on this earlier with some discussion, and that's, I'd like to look at the talent interview process, that piece of CAP. And with that, this is a blind talent interview, meaning the board members who are sitting in and doing the interview have no access to the individual candidate's personal background, their branch, their anything like that. All they have are the assessments so far, I guess, I assume. Now, my question is this, I guess, the right way to go about having this interview conducted? And my concern would be that you have a very diverse group of candidates, meaning you might have officers from, a combat service support or a finance background up against sitting next to an infantry officer, and we kind of have different expectations to a certain extent, I would think, about what they're going to command and how they should go about leading in those organizations. Is that okay to have that kind of that wide of a disparity amongst candidates in the same board, sir?
Well, you actually asked two different questions, so I'll start with the first one, which is the double blind panel interview. So double blind. The interviewee doesn't get to see the panel members, and the panel members don't get to see the interviewee. All information about the individual is redacted, so you have no idea if they've got a combat patch, race, color, creed, religion, anything, it's all blocked out. So it is as fair as it can possibly be, because as much as we'd like to say we carry no biasisms within ourselves, we do. You look at an individual who's got a combat pat from the 82nd, if you served in the 82nd, that's more credible than someone that's got it from 3ID or a different unit. You might look and see how many stripes they've got from how many months they've served downrange, how many awards they might have. Well, those are opportunities that they were afforded, and you can't hold that against an individual that might not have been afforded those same opportunities. So we eliminate some of that biasm by having a double-blind panel interview. The second question that you asked about, and that's why I kind of asked Rich early on about attributes and competencies, and I think he did an incredible job of explaining it. There are some technical and tactical things that we expect as we grow from ranks in different branches and stuff like that. But the baseline attributes and competencies of leadership do not change by branch or grade or rank or anything. It kind of grows as you go into different positions for the level of responsibilities you have. But what we describe as leadership is leadership. So it really doesn't matter, because the board's not going to ask a technical, tactical competency question, because they have no idea if they're talking to somebody that served in a KD3 or XO position, in an armor brigade, an infantry brigade, an MI brigade. That's transparent, and it should be. And I will tell you, what's most impressive about this is every day the board goes through anti-bias training. To understand what the question, don't read into his answers to try and figure out if he's this, that, or she's this or that or the other. These are baseline leadership questions that we expect from every officer within the United States.
Gotcha. Thanks, sir.
Additionally, sir, I'd just like to add, research has shown that probably the traditional face-to-face interview, you invite someone in your office and shake their hand, have some opening comments for each other and say a few words, but that's been shown to probably be the least effective way of hiring an individual and conducting an interview.
So I'll add one more thing to this thing. I will tell you, a double-blind interview is difficult. I mean, when you're giving a briefing and you're standing in front of people, the first thing I was taught as a cadet was reading the body language of your audience to see if you're going in the right direction, and then you can pile on or pull back in that area. This is hard because you're looking at a curtain. You've been given a time allocation to think about the question, and then you've got to respond within a certain amount of time, and you've got a duration that you can speak for, without knowing from body language how you're being perceived. It's interesting, and I'll tell you, I'm a proponent of this process. After seeing it, it works.
Yeah.
Sir, I'd like to add a couple things about the nominative sergeant major. So the nominative sergeant major provided some feedback and assessment to the voting members is all based off the leader requirements model.
Okay.
All right, so it's again based off of that, but it's not based off of anything else to say, hey, I would serve with this person again. It's based off of, hey, I think that the candidate here was able to clearly articulate how they would be able to develop others and build a team. And that's kind of the feedback that the nominative sergeant major would give to the voting members. But also to validate the integrity of the double-blind interview, the sergeant major was asked to determine the gender of the candidates throughout this process. And the sergeant major, or pardon me, the ethnicity of the candidates, and the sergeant major was less than 50% accurate in determining. So it validates the double-blind interview process to make sure, hey, are we doing this and moving in the right direction? And then the other part is it's a talent interview. And it's, something that we need to just be able to better capture as, we're saying, hey, well, what are we doing? What's wrong with the system? Well, how can we optimize the systems that we have in place? So we're looking at talent interviewing. And so if you want to take a look at the enlisted panels, enlisted boards are, we'll frankly say sometimes it's about rote memorization. And we need to have leaders to be able to articulate how they can get after an action, not necessarily what are some specific things they do. So it's getting after the actual talent, and that's what we're trying to assess when we're putting people into position, not necessarily, just only intellect.
Well, in talking to that double-blind bit, we can relate to that in this COVID environment in some ways, right? So if you spent, I spent, 3.5 years in this job of standing in front of a bunch of people and explaining things, in some cases for the first time, to audiences. When you do that blind through MS Teams or Zoom or whatever, because, we turn our cameras off to keep the bandwidth down, you just have to have confidence that people are receiving what you're saying, and you're dying to try to get some feedback, but the way that works with those kind of audits, it doesn't work. So it seems to me that attribute of confidence, whether you have too much of it or too little of it, that's got to be one of those things that just pops up and becomes really obvious off the bat. That people who isn't comfortable in their own skin, or who may be too comfortable in their own skin, kind of thing. That just seems to me to be something that would be something you guys would notice, I guess, when you were doing this.
But in those interviews, sir, what the moderator does for those interviews to help mitigate any of that, and some of our personalities between it being an extrovert or introvert or some of that, is every candidate has 30 seconds to formulate their thing. So it's not to make sure that to avoid the bias of a board member, say, hey, this person's on it, is to make sure every candidate is taking those 30 seconds. So it's not to influence the board members, and it doesn't disadvantage the personality type of the candidate coming through. So I would have to say hats off to CAPD and the Talent Management Task Force for designing this to ensure that this is a world-class, fair, standards-based, and safe assessment all the way through. It's impeccable, some of the details that they put into any of the leader reaction exercise, or the APFT, or the height and weight. Going down there and observing, height and weight. I was like, I've seen the height and weight. I've been a sergeant major. I've been an NCO for, 25 years now. I've been able to see all this. And I was like, this is going to look like every other height and weight in the Army. Absolutely not. It is the most professional height and weight assessment, APFT assessment I've seen. And it is the world-class event in ensuring that we're selecting the best leaders to take, these command positions. And when we talk about the other portions of, you mentioned the branches, sir, and all that. Mm-hmm. Again, what Colonel Cardoni said is, we still have a CSL process. So the boards and the talent interviews and all that, the most weighted criteria is still the matters of performance throughout the candidate's career. That is still the most weighted area.
Yeah, I agree, Sergeant Major. And again, I just want to go back to the specifics of the question about based on your branch, what kind of job you're going to go into, or key billet. Again, these are all behavioral based type questions. They are not looking at OERs, or they figured out what your branch is, or they want to know why you made a specific decision at a specific point in your career. These are behavioral based type questions that really get at the leader requirements model.
Well, so in this has been quite successful so far. I think BCAP has. Now, the Army decided that it would go ahead and expand this to the Colonel Command Assessment Program, CCAP. General Masaracchia, can you give us some insight onto where that program's at, and how is it different from BCAP?
Well, I'll let Chris talk about the differences, but I'll talk the first portion of that question. Number one, it was piloted last year for the first time, and it was very successful. Successful to the point that senior Army leadership, after what they saw through the BCAP process and this first pilot program, has decided to continue it. So it will hit our second iteration this coming year in October. and it will continue after that.
Thanks, sir. There are a number of changes. There's some changes to the assessments because really you're moving, BCAP, you're still at the direct level of leadership. You're going to CCAP, you're being looked at the 06 level. You're moving to the organizational level of leadership. So really the assessments are adjusted to account for that. And the other piece is, probably over 90% of our senior leaders come from key billet or command positions as 06s. So we're really looking at trying to see if we could assess in terms of their strategic potential as well. But those are the two major pieces, differences in the programs.
Thanks, sir. Now, it looks like these programs are going to continue to expand, and that's why I was curious, sir, what do you see on the future for the expansion of the Commander Assessment Program?
It'll expand to account for example, we already ran through Talent Management Task Force this past iteration, October, November timeframe, did the Army Leader Acquisition Program piece of it, or our Acquisition Corps officers that were going in to assume some positions at the 06 level. So that was just run just for the military personnel within the Acquisition Corps. We're thinking in the future probably selection of division chaplains may take part, the medical community as well. So, and Sergeant Major already mentioned the Sergeant's Major also went through a pilot this past fall as well. So expansion is on the horizon, that's for sure. I know the Talent Management Task Force is already leaning forward and planning for that, and we're set to, we already found out the decision's been made. We're going to execute Command Assessment Program in October or November of next year.
Gotcha. So, Sergeant Major Ferguson, on that note, can you maybe give us a little bit more insight into the Sergeant Major Assessment Program and where it's at?
Yes, sir. In November last year, it was more of a prototype for the Sergeant Major Assessment. So we had 28 volunteers that came up through there. So it's a little bit different than the pilot of having, the Army actually getting out there and selecting folks. So we had 28 volunteers come through. And other than the ACET, the Army Commander Evaluation Tool, the Sergeant Majors took the Leader 360, which is to where the Sergeant Majors got to select their peer and subordinate feedback and kind of give that stuff. So that was probably the main difference between the two assessments. Again, everything is based off the leader requirements model. Now, the board members were a little bit different. So the voting members were all, nominative sergeant majors. And then the non-voting member was a lieutenant colonel who had previous battalion commander experience, either current or previous. And that officer did the same role that the nominative sergeant major had with the BCAP and CCAP process. I would say that all of the peers and out of the AARs, the sergeant majors, we're all in agreement that this is something that we need to continue to look forward and to assess to go forward. So that our recommendations and decisions are still up with senior leaders in the Army, or how it's going to be conducted through CAPD and the Talent Management Task Force to get after how do we maximize this, and how do we refine some of the tools and assessments for sergeant majors. What is a different evaluation tool for sergeant majors that we're looking for officers based off of certain things? But again, we're primarily all still looking at the leader requirements model.
Yeah, and I can expand on that a little, Chris. So, so some people who are listening here may have previously experienced the MSAF, or it provided folks and individuals an opportunity to get peer, subordinate, and feedback from superiors. But there are some distinct differences between the Army Commander's Evaluation Tool, which has been used in BCAP and CCAP to this point. And as the Sergeant Major described, we're in the beginning phases of the development of a similar tool that assesses individuals that will go into leadership positions of greater responsibility, but may not be a commander with, say, UCMJ responsibilities. And so in one case, that might be our Sergeant Majors, our acquisition population. But the difference is when an individual did a Leader 360 or an MSAF, they selected those peers and subordinates and superiors to provide them feedback because it was about their development. The difference is the ASET, and then what happens with the ASET is through a process working with the Human Resources Command as well as Army Talent Management Task Force, individuals from that candidate's passed, generally in the last 3 to 5 years, are invited to provide peer and subordinate feedback. So the individual's completely unaware of who's being asked to provide feedback, and it's completely anonymous to those providing that feedback into the ASET, which informs this process. It doesn't decide whether an individual commands or doesn't command. It just provides peers and subordinates an opportunity to provide their observations about an individual, their perspective. And some of those things, and that what the tool looks at is it tries to help determine whether that individual or candidate may be exhibiting some counterproductive leadership traits. It also just asks some pointed questions about their perspectives, again, of those peers and subordinates. But the key is the individual being assessed doesn't know who's doing it, and they don't select him, which really adds another layer of anonymity, but also probably a layer of accuracy. So I'm not picking my friends or my bros. The Army is selecting those people based on my relationship with them as a peer or subordinate in my career.
Thanks, sir. Now, before we switch topics here, I want to add one last question, and that is, what does the organizational future of the Command Assessment Program look like? I understand it's managed somewhat by the Army Talent Management Task Force, but we have, sir, your new directorate, Colonel Cardoni, that you're working with. How does this future, what does it look like? When will you take this, or how long will the Army Talent Management Task Force hang on to it?
It was initially assumed that Command Assessment Program Directorate here within CAC and MC, Mission Command Center of Excellence, would assume the entire program. That has since changed. We found working with TMTF, you look at what the Army's done in terms of closing our gaps in terms of and modernization with our platforms and our equipment, cross-functional teams, long-range precision fires, cross-functional teams. Mm-hmm. What Talent Management Task Force has identified is there is nobody out there or no proponent that is actually looking at modernizing in terms of talent management. Mm-hmm. So we're doing a great job with all our weapons and platforms and those types of things, but the most important piece of our Army, our personnel, our talent, the great individuals serving within the Army, there's nobody looking long-term.
What we're currently seeing on the horizon is an organization at the Army enterprise level that's going to have the ability to look deep in terms of talent management, really taking care of the policy level issues regarding talent management, collecting data, analyzing data, and really at the Command Assessment Program Directorate here down in MCCO is really the execution of the CAP program itself.
Now to jump topics here, I kind of want to move over to Project Athena. And so, Colonel Saine, if you could give us just an overview of Project Athena, where it's at in its implementation, and what the Army's getting after with this self-development assessment program.
Great. Again, thanks, Chris. Some of the listeners here may have already experienced this or heard about through some of their friends, but what I can offer is that everyone who goes through some level of PME is going to experience or be able to benefit from Project Athena. So what Project Athena really is it's a new leader development program grounded in the Army's people strategy, as put out by General McConville, our Chief of Staff of the Army. But it's really a TRADOC program that uses some standardized or a battery of assessments designed to support a leader's growth and their development. So it's not talent management. Probably a better way to term it, it's talent development. So what those assessments do, and again, those assessments really, a part of those assessments are what we've all experienced in our PME experience already, and that is the physical component. So it was the Army Physical Fitness Test, it's now the Army Combat Fitness Test. And then what we refer to as the warfighting element, and that is the elements within the POI and the standards that we're graded to help us be successful once we depart or graduate from that phase of PME into our next set of jobs in the Army. But really, there's a series of those other assessments, and they are web-based. Some are commercial or civilian, and most were developed here at CAPL and in concert with the Army Research Institute. And those assessments really are they do two real main things, and that's one, to help an individual become more self-aware. So how do I view myself versus how my peers and subordinates perceive me or see me? Am I adaptive? Am I a leader with good communication skills? So really, self-awareness is number one, and then really those assessments, along with some other, help an individual to focus their leader development. And so what does that mean? So as I become more self-aware and I understand better where my strengths may lie and where some of my developmental gaps or weaknesses, or really you could just say those areas I'm not as strong in, it's to inform really the next phase of the effort, and that is the development of what we might call an individual development plan or self-development plan, or we might simply call a developmental counseling statement. And that just helps the individual and PME to set some goals based on the results in that battery of assessments, as well as how they performed in the course, how they have performed the Army Combat Fitness Test, and then what they see as their goals as they move into the next phase of their career in the Army. But again, it's all about self-development. And really what that means is, in terms of assessments, there's a couple types of assessments. And some assessments are referred to as developmental, and some are predictive. And all that means is if it's developmental, it's designed to just help the individual who's taking it. They own the information, they own the data, and then they can choose to share it with an instructor, a small group leader, a mentor, to help guide their efforts into becoming a better leader and a better soldier. A predictive assessment, as we've kind of talked about here as a part of the Command Assessment Program, that's to help the Army make a decision. And the Army will use that information for talent management, and that's that distinction between talent development and talent management. So in terms of Athena itself, it was really an idea early last year with General Funk in concert with Lieutenant General Rainey, the CG of CAC. But it was started in our basic officer leader courses, or BOLICs, with our second lieutenants across all 17 of our branches, and also piloted in the maneuver captain's career course. And that started in the summer of 2020 with these battery of assessments to really help us learn and to grow in the program. Recently, in this month, all those assessments and the entire Project Athena effort is growing into all captain's career course, which means by this month, next month, all captain's career course at all 17 branches will be taking their series of assessments that have been developed for those leaders at that level. And then the Command and General Staff Officers course will also begin to take these assessments sometime here in the spring of 2021.
So, sir, you mentioned an interesting point here, and that is that these assessments, it sounds like they vary by grade or level of PME. Is that correct?
They do. Now, some of the assessments, I mean, obviously the war fighting and the physical fitness component change with your echelon of PME. Some of the assessments, generally those in terms of my self-awareness or individual self-awareness, will slightly change or not change over time. And that's to help an individual really understand and, if necessary, make some immediate adjustments to their personal strategies of behavior. So things that we described, like the Leader 360, which is a peer and subordinate assessment, or the Leader 180, which is really a peer evaluation, those will be taken by individuals throughout their PME experiences, because they will change as leaders, they will grow and mature, but it'll help them understand how they are versus the perceptions and observations of their peers and subordinates. Some of the assessments will change, and that really they will change based on what the expectations of the Army are for those leaders or individuals at that level of leadership in the Army. And that's all grounded in the Army Leadership Requirements Model, and is designed to, once again, inform that individual's self-awareness and then help to focus their self-development. So again, they can become the best version of themselves moving forward in their chosen career.
Hey, but Sam, so for some, we're all old guys and sitting here in the room, except for a couple, but Chris, but so throughout my career, for example, starting at BOLIC or the basic course back in the old days, you had a reading test, right? You had the Army Effective Writing Test. You had a personality test. Forget which one it is. Myers-Briggs, right? And so I always saved all those things, and you keep them, and you have your AERs, right, from the schoolhouse as well. But I think what I'm hearing is that wasn't necessarily true in every branch, in every school. And the other piece is nobody ever did anything with it. I collected them and saved them and watched how they changed over time. But it never seemed like it was related to the AER or how well I did in school. And then AERs weren't necessarily related to or treated the same way as OERs were, which was always seemed a little frustrating. That, you know, if you bust your butt in school to become better, you really didn't get any different benefit than somebody that was kind of coasting. So,
well, no, Chris, I mean, those are some great points, and you're right. The part of our challenge was it wasn't standardized across our Army. It wasn't standardized across all branches. But what has been found over time is that an individual with greater self-awareness is a more aware leader. And is a better leader. And that has been reinforced through the BCAP and CCAP experience. And then the other thing you kind of described was, you know, you took those things and stuck them in this little folder and held on to them. You were probably the anomaly, I might say. But, you know, what comes with this is we're also leveraging technology and automation with this process. So the vast majority of the assessments are all being provided to individuals for their access throughout their career, and that's that career-long assessments thing, through a system called the Army Enterprise Assessment System, or AAS. That just means that an individual take an assessment, they use their CAT card, they log on, they take assessments. The assessment provides them what's called an individual feedback report, which they use to inform that individual development or self-development plan, but that is on there forever. So as an officer, or as we grow the program in the non-commissioned officer corps, the civilian education system, and with our warrant officers, there'll be a record of that for you to utilize throughout your career. And that means you'll be able to go back and reference, but not in a folder, stuff them into a folder, but on this system. And then there are some other tools that we're introducing to help an individual, you know, pull that information together and to, once again, leverage technology to help them create the best possible plan or set of goals for them to get better in those areas that have been identified they're maybe weaker than their peers, or they just simply want to get better in. So some great points. And again, the program is new, and so there are continuous improvements, and that's being informed by the experiences that we've already observed for the last 6-7 months in our BOLIC courses, as well as Captain Career course, and essentially a network of individuals in our COEs and branch schools, which are providing feedback. As we move forward into 2021, the scientists that work in CAPL are going to begin to conduct what's called a program evaluation. That just means that, like everything we do in the Army, we want to assess. Are we doing the right things? Are we doing them right? And so they're going to step through essentially a scientific process to get feedback from students that were assessed, from instructors, as well as looking at the data to figure out, are we using the right assessments? Are they at the right place in your career, Chris, as you talked about? And again, this is all focused on the individual. And again, so as General Masaracchia has said before, if you want to get better, then Project Athena is for you. If you're not interested in getting better, then you know, you probably need to take a look inside yourself. So
Okay, so I just got the entry point that I was looking for. Hey,
I tried.
got a platform that I talk to lieutenants, to captains, and soon-to-be majors about Project Athena. And Sam already hit it. This is your assessment. Nobody gets this. This is not predictive in nature. It's not going to your next battalion commander. You're not your next brigade commander. The only thing that is done is a self-development form, which you can share if you'd like to with your counselor, which is your SGI, or potentially your next battalion or brigade commander, as he helps the organization develop an LPD program to address some of those weaknesses that are the aggregate across the cohort that he brings into his organization. I think as we talk about leadership, the foundation of leadership is trust, and I think we have a trust issue out there right now, because I hear all the conspiracy theorists out there tell me about, I don't want to share anything because it's going to be used against me. If the Army does a drawdown, or if I go to a unit and there's extra captains, they're going to utilize this to say when I go into command. Completely false. Now, there is one component that is shared out of Project Athena, and that is the aggregate of a cohort that goes through BOLIC or CCC or CGSC. That is the aggregate information of everybody that took the test that helps inform the institution on how they need to change their POI. No name, no nothing. Just an aggregate of cohort year group such and such. So there is one aspect of it, but that's it. And as Sam mentioned, I ask 3 questions when I talk to people about Athena. Are you as good as you want to be, or as good as you need to be to lead our soldiers? 2, are you willing to be completely honest with yourself on your self-assessments? And the third one is, are you willing to work hard enough to be as good as you need to be to lead our soldiers? If the first answer that you said, are you good enough, your answer is yes, then Project Athena is not for you. Because you can't be honest as you answer that first question with yourself. The second two, if the answer is yes to those two, then Project Athena is for you. This is the Army offering an opportunity for you to get better at what we do for a living in our profession. And that's about as serious as it gets. The second part of this is the Army is attempting to educate you and help you for this topic that we just finished talking about, which was BCAP and CCAP. If you're self-aware early in your career and you take the right steps to close those gaps and eliminate those blind spots, then BCAP and CCAP should be easy for you as they ask those questions, because it's all about self-awareness. So this is a project that the Army has instituted to help the individual soldier personally get better at what he is supposed to do for our nation.
Sir, and you brought up some great points there, and there's just one I like to pull the thread on, and that's the follow-through on the assessments and the self or individual development plan. Is that, if an individual takes that and leaves their PME experience and sticks it in a manila folder, Rich, like we talked about before, and doesn't do anything about it, well, I mean, that's a personal choice. That's a kind of a self-selection thing in itself. But really, what the program's designed for is that individual, that assessed in this initial phase officer, to take that individual self-development plan and share it with when they move to their operational unit, to share it with their rater. Or if they're not comfortable initially, with some mentor. Because what it does is, while some of us years ago may have had a little 3x5 card on our refrigerator that said, well, here's my 5-year and 10-year plan, that was the depth of it. It was based on, I don't know, our own personal goals, but not informed by these assessments and a greater understanding of our own self. As other people see us, and then as we move through, our personal development in life, and as an individual or an officer in the Army. But if they carry that self or individual development plan forward to their operational unit, that would help a commander at whatever level to, one, better understand that soldier that's walking in the organization, but really help them to realize their goals, both professional and personal. So again, it really helps us to accelerate that process that should happen in the force. But we've all got to know that to ask for it and look for it.
That's related back to what General Maz said. You framed it a certain way. Am I as good as I need to be? Yeah, I tend to look at this as, am I as good as I think I am? And because that's another piece of this. So we've all had this experience, and it's something that I do with initial counselings for people to join our team, because it's a kind of a strange place. But you ask people, what are your goals and so forth. Talk to me about, are you still in the hunt for either promotion or the command track or so forth. And the percentage of people that are taken aback by those kinds of questions who are, in some cases or in many cases, overly optimistic, and then you don't find out till later that, well, I thought I was in great shape because nobody told me differently. And it kind of relates back to, when you have a senior rater profile. I had a senior rater one time warn me, when I first was in 05 Command and was going to have a senior rater profile. He said, you're going to find out some very strange things. And one of the strange things is, if, say, you senior rate 30 people, the only 4 or 5 people that are going to come back and complain about an OAR are generally the bottom 4 or 5 people who had no idea that they were an order of magnitude less capable as leaders than everybody else. They consider themselves at the top in terms of their self-evaluation.
And what's that called? That's a lack of
self-awareness. Exactly.
Okay.
So I just think that that's a powerful thing, and it goes right back to the leadership requirements model that's in the doctrine. But that's a lot of its attributes, but it really gets the competencies when you get out in the operational force.
I'll tell you, the one thing that this just keeps bringing up is, hey, the one equalizer is work ethic. It doesn't matter what your IQ is or how you do on tests. It's your work ethic. Because the smartest guy in the room who's not willing to put in the energy and the effort is going to get outworked by the dumbest guy in the room who's willing to do whatever it takes and refuses to be outworked. That guy's going to be successful. So if you're not willing to be totally honest with yourself on these tests, and when I say totally honest with yourself, we all have that thing where you read something, you're like, well, I do show tendencies of that sometimes, I could say yes on that. Well, if you had to go through that process and the answer is no, and you need to be honest enough to be hard on yourself if you really want to be better. And then the last part of it is work ethic. How bad do you want it? And I'll tell you, that's why I love the BCAP and CCAP selection process, because we're offering people a chance to compete. How bad do I want it? Am I going to prepare? Am I going to put the work in to go in there? There's only a couple areas that you can probably put a lot of work into, but I'll tell you, it's the number one thing that everybody complains about, the PT test. No, the PT test is absolutely too standard, as written. That's always been written. We're just holding ourselves accountable to what we've agreed are the standards. You can overcome that with will and work ethic.
That's just like being a walk-on versus a scholarship guy, right? So.
Now, Colonel Saine, with Project Athena, as we discussed, it's currently conducted in PME, and that's BOLIC, career course, and then CGSC for some officers there who stay in that long. Now, is there any look at expanding this outside of just TRADOC and maybe trying to nest it with the counseling and evaluation process? So outside of those 3 times in a career, you get more feedback? Any idea?
I think it's a great question. There's really kind of 2 parts to the answer. I think the first part is inside of TRADOC, as we've kind of talked about it here. As Project Athena was in this initial phase, it was introduced inside the officer education system. So as you described, the BOLIC, Captain's Career Course, and CGSOC. Really throughout FY21, we're going to introduce assessments, some of the same assessments, but again, focused at that echelon or the individual's level of PME, and then inside their cohort. So those pilots are going to occur across the non-commissioned officer professional development system. So think in terms of the basic leaders course, ALC, SLC, and the master and the MLC. We're going to introduce it in the warrant officer PME. So in the WOBC, WAC, and then at Fort Rucker at the ILE and SSE versions. And then finally, because we're a total force and a total Army, we're going to introduce it in the Army Material Staff College. So in the civilian education system, which some of your listeners may not even be aware exists. So they have a similar system with the basic, intermediate, advanced course. And so these assessments are going to be piloted in all 3 of those cohorts at all those echelons at probably about 3 locations in fiscal year 21. And then throughout fiscal year 22, we're going to grow it across every installation that holds courses or PME for those. And so that means 32 BLCs, and that means 17 branches for our warrant officers, and dozens, if not 100 different disciplines, as well as, again, across all parts of the civilian education system. I think the last piece is, like I said before, just like our civilians, Compo 2 and Compo 3 are National Guard and Reserve components of our total force, are just as important as the active side. And over time, after we've grown it and we've done some program evaluation and gotten it right, we're also going to grow it across our Compo 2 and Compo 3. Sometimes that's a little bit more of a challenge because an individual in Compo 2 and 3's PME experience is a little bit different. And we want to make sure they're afforded the same opportunities that those of us that are in the Compo 1 or the active component. The second part of your question is in the operational force. Mm-hmm. So, as I previously kind of described, it's, the intent of this program is PME is just those gates we all walk through as we mature in our career, no matter if we're a non-commissioned officer, an officer, a warrant officer, or a Department of the Army civilian. That's just where we take the assessments. The real key, as we described before, is taking the results from those assessments, as well as the results from that PME experience, and putting that into a plan that'll help you get better, and then sharing that with our raters, senior raters, or mentors as we move the operational force to help us realize the goals or objectives inside that plan. I think the last piece is there are elements of Project Athena which will grow into the operational force in the same way. Not the cognitive assessments and non-cognitive assessments that are testing our critical thinking or our self-awareness, because you're getting that in PME, and the distance between those PME experiences such that it's spaced about appropriately. But there is some powerful uses in things like the Leader 360. So it has been reformed or revised from what some may know as MSAF to add components like the counterproductive leadership elements or tendencies, but also to ensure it's fully nested in the Army Leader Requirements Model. And so that over time, what we're building is an opportunity for units to leverage that assessment.
That aggregate data?
The aggregate data. So a commander, and under MSAF, there was a similar program. It would allow essentially a brigade level commander to introduce that assessment across his or her organization, and generally that's probably inside of our leaders at the platoon level and above. It allows the commander allows each of those individuals to take that assessment, to become more self-aware, and maybe that's because they're outside their PME, but it really allows the commander, and like you said, in an aggregate fashion, to understand his or her organization better. So how do his lieutenants or how do his sergeant first classes, what are they strong in or maybe less strong in? And that could really help that commander to make some more informed decisions about a unit leader development program. It's not the do-all and end-all. It can be combined with some other things that are available throughout the Army. And one that the CAPL has developed was the Command Climate Navigator. I kind of side referenced it before, and that's really to help a command team take the results of their command climate survey, look at the results, and to develop a plan to address those areas that may be of concern or they're just not, they want to get better at. So.
And Sam, that's key because, let's face it, for the majority of officers, probably CGSOC is the last PME they're ever going to go to. Mm-hmm. It was as it relates to BCAP and CCAP. It would be remiss if we brought all these candidates down to Fort Knox and they didn't get any feedback. So build into BCAP and CCAP as well. As you were saying, Rich, like you put your Myers-Briggs in the book, but nobody ever did anything with it. So what'll happen is at the end of the comprehensive talent interview, the candidate will go do a 30-minute outbrief with the operational psychologist, and if the individual by that time, having go through 4 days of 9 different assessments, they probably identified a few gaps they may have not known in the past, but the operational psychologist really takes the totality of those assessments, minus the ACTI, because that has just happened maybe an hour prior, and really helps the candidate identify some of those gaps that they may have. And then at the end of the program and during the AR, both BCAP and CCAP, Major General McGee, the Director of Army Talent Management Task Force, will post, hey, every candidate in this room has the opportunity to seek professional coaching. It's a civilian coach. They won't have the information or your assessments from BCAP or CCAP, but it's another opportunity outside of Athena or outside of the unit to go ahead and close some of those gaps you may have identified going through the process.
Is there any thought given to the possibility of giving the selection board access to previous Project Athena type assessments?
So Colonel Cardoni's team and the team at CAPL work closely together, but also work closely with Talent Management Task Force. And this question is one we've gotten all the time because some might say, well, more information is better. And that might be true, but there's this trust element that General Masaracchia talked before. And as I previously described, there's the 2 general types of assessment, developmental and predictive. Project Athena falls wholly in the lane of developmental, which means the individual being assessed owns that information and data, other than the aggregate data, which is an entire class, an entire year group, an entire branch, and that's to help the Army make a more informed decision. And while the efforts of Project Athena and the Command Assessment Program are complementary, or as General Masaracchia described before, if I took advantage of all the elements of Project Athena, make myself more self-aware, and to develop myself in those focus areas which I was less strong in, I am going to perform better when I get an opportunity to go to the Command Assessment Program, whether BCAP or CCAP or the Sergeant Majors or acquisition or whomever. And so over time, really, that's about improving the Army's readiness and really improving the Army's personnel. So as Colonel Cardoni talked before, that is the one area where our Army, our joint force, continues to have an edge. And this is a way that the programs are complementary and work together. But again, that data from Project Athena is completely owned by that individual who has been assessed, where the data that is collected as part of the Command Assessment Program is the Army's to make a more informed decision. Now, there will be opportunities in the future for an individual who takes assessments in Athena to share it with other people, as we talked about before. And so in terms of knowledge, skills, and behaviors, which Colonel Creed alluded to before. We use some of those on the officer side right now to inform our AIM 2 choices, but those are self-professed, which means I might say, well, I'm a great writer, or I am a wonderful public speaker. Well, what some of the Project Athena assessments will do is allow that KSB to move from something I self-profess or believe in myself to something that there's some quantifiable information that says, yes, I am. That's another step in the process, but again, just wanted to make it really clear that we have to maintain the trust for everybody participating in Project Athena. That's your information and data, and you are the only one that can share that. But again, never forget what we've talked about before, which is this is all about you getting better, and you deciding that that your improved self-awareness and your improvement in areas where your performance in some form of assessment was less strong, that you now have a pathway to get better. So if you so choose to participate in a BCAP or CCAP in the future, that you're better prepared.
Thanks, sir. Well, gentlemen, on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. Thank you for joining me today.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I'd also like to thank our listeners and note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, the Combined Arms Center, or the Mission Command Center of Excellence. I'm Major Chris Parker, and this is Breaking Doctrine.